There were things happening in video games that we'd not seen before, and Snake Eater was a game that was like, it was super ambitious and they pulled it off.
It's not often that a franchise can stand the test of time quite like the Metal Gear Solid series. Whether it be its ahead of its time gameplay, campy and radical storytelling, or its strangely prosthetic take on serious issues such as the dangers of information overload through the use of junk data and memes, Metal Gear Solid has always found itself a step ahead of its contemporaries in more ways than one. In this episode of IGN Rewind, we're going to go back to the early 2000s and look at a game that not only set itself apart in an era of great titles, but is also considered one of the greatest games of all time. It's a game that not only captured the hearts and minds of a generation of gamers, but also pushed the boundaries on what's possible in storytelling through video games and interactive media.
There was a formula that they would play to, and Kojima would routinely break that in all of his games, and in this one in particular.
This is the life and legacy of Metal Gear Solid 3: Snake Eater. The year is 2004. IGN was celebrating its 8th year as a website, cell phones were seemingly unbreakable bricks, and it had been 3 years since the release of Metal Gear Solid 2. While series creator Hideo Kojima had lightly discussed the game's jungle setting and showed off a trailer at the previous year's E3, it wasn't until the summer of 2004 that we saw any gameplay footage and learned about its Cold War meets 1960s spy thriller setting.
The environment gives a whole new meaning to Welcome to the Jungle.
Even with the drawing power of PlayStation 2, it was really hard to come up with an entire jungle with a natural environment, something that most video games have avoided. To create such a detailed natural environment, we ended up renewing the graphics engine and the gameplay engine as well. When you actually step into the jungle and when you're standing there, that sense of presence, you really feel like you're in a jungle.
The game stayed true to its legacy and included an absurd attention to detail in its gameplay mechanics, a healthy amount of camp to complement its dark and gritty story, and an excessive amount of pop culture references in its dialogue.
Snake, have you seen Dr. Strangelove or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb?
What?
Snake Eater received overwhelming praise from critics and fans, and IGN gave it a 9.6, stating, "This is a true return to form and a hell of a way for the series to wrap up several plot lines in an exciting way."
So let's go back to 2004.
Yep.
What was the hype like around the launch?
Oh, I mean, it was huge. I mean, so Metal Gear Solid 2, the hype around that was sort of that, it was like unlike anything I'd ever seen. Like, I can remember them showing the trailer for that game at E3 and just people like standing up and applauding. And I think, so we were on this sort of curve in terms of Kojima's reputation and whatever he was going to do next.
The game would go on to sell nearly 4 million units in less than a year, and similar to the previous Metal Gear Solid titles, would receive an updated version called Metal Gear Solid 3: Subsistence. The game added a plethora of new features, such as improved gameplay mechanics, a cutscene theater, and if you weren't stuck with the slowest dial-up internet ever like most of us, me included, the first version of Metal Gear Online.
When they re-released it as Subsistence, they kind of like improved on it even further.
Yeah.
I mean, just changing the camera made a huge difference.
Coming out the same year as World of Warcraft and Half-Life 2, and then still being seen as one of the greats shows how
And I think
impactful it is.
I think what Kojima did, and he really perfected it with Metal Gear Solid 3, was just this sort of scale of production and ambition. This was a period, and the PS2 was full of examples of this, but it was a period where the scope of games increased exponentially, right? You know, just like what was possible with the tech. Another game that was out there, Burnout 3 was that year as well. So that was the year that like the takedown stuff was happening, and just being able to do things in environments that felt really huge, and like there were things happening in video games that we'd not seen before. And I think the PS2 was clearly, there was a lot more potential in that box than anyone had ever anticipated.
Yeah.
And Metal Gear and Snake Eater was a game that was like, it was super ambitious and they pulled it off.
Subsistence wasn't the final incarnation of Metal Gear Solid 3. In the following years, fans would get to revisit the totally realistic jungles of Russia with HD ports, unique updates, and even a heartbreaking visual remaster of the game's cinematics. When it comes to successful video games, remakes and remasters aren't anything new. And like other games in the series, it wouldn't be hard to Halo jump back into the jungle outside of its original release.
So this game actually hit kind of the peak moment in 2 subsequent generations. Like,
Yeah.
2004, 2005 was like absolutely the PlayStation 2's kind of like glory days, and 2011 was the Xbox 360's glory period. And it was sort of like, and they were able to sort of take a game and make it feel contemporary again. And they took all the best bits out of Subsistence and they made it look nicer, and it ran at 60 frames a second, and it was kind of like, it was really solid. I think if I was going to go back and play it, it would be the 361 that I went back and played.
While Metal Gear Solid 3 got an HD port later on PlayStations, Xbox consoles, and the Vita, Snake Eater's most unique remaster came in 2012 with the release of the long-winded title Metal Gear Solid 3D Snake Eater for the Nintendo 3DS. Bet you couldn't have guessed that one.
Snake Eater 3D is a strong port of an already excellent game. The key thing to consider is whether you want this game in portable form, which does come with some limitations. MGS3 wasn't exactly designed with the 3DS in mind. Lengthy cutscenes don't suit gaming on the go, and the attention to detail can be lost on the smaller screen. However, in exchange you get some great 3D effects and some great control enhancements. Bottom line, if you want an epic adventure for your 3DS, it's hard to do better than this.
Unfortunately, the same can't be said about the next update of Metal Gear Solid 3.
The Metal Gear Solid franchise may be coming to pachinko if a new trademark filed by Konami Parlor Entertainment, KPE, is any indication. First spotted by Kotaku, Konami has filed a Big Boss trademark in specific relation to video games and board games, as well as smartphone games, metal games, slot machines, and pachinko machines. It's important to note that Konami's new trademark doesn't confirm the company will be making Metal Gear pachinko machines. However, it does seem likely given Konami's profitability in this particular market. While recent reports suggest Konami is stepping away from big-budget console games, the Japanese publisher insists it's still committed to console game development. In fact, Konami community manager Graham Day went so far as to say that the Metal Gear Solid franchise can continue without Hideo Kojima.
It was revealed that the only way to revisit the game's most memorable moments with a Fox Engine facelift would be through a Japanese-exclusive pachinko machine.
Actually, I cursed. I did. I actually straight up cursed. I was that mad. The trailer, which debuted yesterday, is currently garnering a dislike ratio of more than 300 to 1. For context, Infinite Warfare's ratio was just over 6 to 1, and Ghostbusters about 4 to 1. Do you know why? Because when you put up a video of a new Metal Gear Solid game, and instead of it being an awesome stealth action game starring our favorite Metal Gear Solid characters, it's a game about metal balls bouncing around a screamingly loud machine in a smoke-filled parlor in a country most of us will never visit, we're gonna be a little upset.
Needless to say, the response was less than stellar when images and videos of these newly modeled cutscenes surfaced online. And fans were left speculating and wishing they could replay Operation Snake Eater again, but with modern visuals. So it goes.
Look at this! It's the end of Metal Gear Solid 3, but it's in a friggin' pachinko machine! Look at that! Why aren't we getting this as a game?
Yeah,
I'm so mad about this.
So what do you think are the odds that they'll take these renders and they'll recreate Metal Gear Solid 3? And they'll put it out without Kojima's help. Konami needs the money.
I mean, it wouldn't be the first time. We got Twin Snakes on the GameCube, which was that was what, Digital Knights, and they took Metal Gear Solid 1 and they dumped it into the engine for 2, and Kojima apparently hated it and washed his hands of it. So it's not the first time that Konami sort of had like a, kind of a cash in, but like, I kind of hope that we get, it'd be awesome to get Snake Eater all over again, and if they just use his, his stuff as sort of a platformer, as a skeleton for what the game should be, and then just dump it in Fox Engine and, give us the controls of Phantom Pain and, adjust the gameplay as much as you can. I don't know. I mean, write your representatives, I guess.
Yeah.
It's weird, this game's aged really well, in a way that few games do. But again, that year, there were a lot of games that aged well that year. I think Half-Life 2 and San Andreas in particular have aged particularly well from back then, because it was a period of time where a lot of things about the way games are presented to the audience sort of matured around that period, where people weren't reinventing controls over and over. There were certain things about the way you interact with the game that became standardized, and I think in hindsight what this did is it established that sort of that stealthy mechanic that we now see in so many games that's just part of a game that isn't focused on stealth. But I think he refined and set the expectations of what that felt like, and I think that's kind of like a big part of its legacy. And I think very often with Kojima games you think about you know, how wild the story is or kind of how weird it is, but I think there are some fundamental mechanical things in this game, more so than 2, that really, like, you know, the games today are still kind of borrowing from it.
Its impact has rippled across video games years after its release. The final encounter with the boss during the game's climax is the perfect example of this. Throughout the story, the player is shown how much the boss means to Snake and the rest of the game's cast. Who is a hero in her own right that not only sacrifices herself for the greater good, but also gives Snake one final task as his mentor. This encounter ends in an expertly choreographed fight and then prompts the player to pull the trigger and take the boss's life.
What are your thoughts on the game making the player pull the trigger?
I mean, I can remember at the time that was kind of like, there were a few game designers other than Kojima that would have put you in that position, because I think he very openly talked about what's going on outside of the game as well as inside of the game. Like, I mean, he did it with the previous 2 Metal Gear Solid games, right? Where whether it's cute things like your controller dancing over the table, or them reading the memory card or whatever, there were a bunch of things that were external to the game. And I think that moment was another Kojima putting the drama off the screen rather than on the screen. And I mean, it's very much the type of decision that you associate with him as a designer and a storyteller. It's not the game telling you that something uncomfortable is going to happen. It literally makes it uncomfortable.
Yeah, it goes from a boss fight that's pretty standard, you know, beating up the boss.
Yeah.
Literally. And then a big cutscene, and it's like, okay, there's this big emotional crescendo, and then it's, all right, now you have to do it.
Yeah.
The player. It's not going to be a cutscene. It's not going to cut away.
I mean, still, you see things like that more in indie games today than you do in big budget AAA games, where they'll take a moment like that and they'll try and they sort of like manipulate your emotions. And he was great at that. And I think this game in particular, this game is long.
Yeah.
I mean, it's what? I mean, you can mainline the story all the way through in about 16, 17 hours, but it felt long and it had some big cutscenes, right?
Yep.
And then to cap it off with something like that is like, it was really manipulative, but I think it made it all the more memorable. You know, and I think there aren't many games where when you're talking about you talk about it like this, and I think that alone makes it remarkable, even 20 years later.
Underneath its occasionally campy dialogue, the overly chatty cast of characters, because everyone just talks so much in the jungle.
When the going gets tough, movies can save your life. It's always good to be able to look at things from a different perspective when you get in a jam. That's the magic of movies.
Metal Gear Solid 3 expertly tells the story about the very real dangers of a Cold War-era nuclear war between the West and Russia, and how a heroic and decorated soldier can become disillusioned in the face of adversity and the realities of geopolitics.
You are a true patriot.
Story beats aside, Metal Gear Solid 3 was revolutionary at its release due to its intuitive and creative stealth gameplay and exotic setting.
I mean, what was interesting is that in 2004, we weren't all talking about it on Twitter. We weren't like, you would maybe go on a message board and like we would get letters to the magazine about it. But there wasn't this sort of like huge discourse about it the way you would have right now. So I think if it was the same situation, but now, it would be talked about the way in sort of, you know, it's up there with like Red Wedding in Game of Thrones type,
yeah,
like social energy moment. Like if a bunch of people were playing it right now and that happened, I think it would have been a much bigger moment if everyone was connected more.
This fusion of gameplay and tragic storytelling is one of the many examples of why Snake Eater is seen as one of the best games of all time, almost 20 years since its release in 2004.
Okay, so after all these years, why do you think Konami wanted to bring it back?
It's weird, right? If I had have guessed what they were going to do, I would have thought they'd go back to the beginning. But narratively, it's sort of the beginning, so I kind of get it from that perspective. And 1 and 2 were quite kind of clinical, metallic.
It's a lot of gray.
A lot of gray, flat.
Yeah.
And even making those things more beautiful, you're just going to have sort of rusty metal panels or whatever. But I think going into the jungle, there's an opportunity to be like, look how much better this looks now. So I kind of get it from that perspective. And I think narratively, I would guess it's the beginning of the story, even though it's the third game.
How do you think this game will translate to a new audience now that we've had generations of titles between now and 2004?
I think there are some things about Metal Gear, just some of the conventions of the control, like the way that you manage your inventory and just things, the way you interact with things. I think there's an expectation now with games where people are conditioned to expect very like contextual systems, like whether it's Zelda or Assassin's Creed, you go up to something and the game kind of interprets your intent. Whereas with Metal Gear, you had to tell it specifically what you wanted to do, and those little sort of like drawer things would pop open in the UI, and you would have to specifically pick the thing, and that ages it. When you go back and play it, that feels like an older game, right? And I think for a modern audience that doesn't have the nostalgia of playing it the first time around, if they don't update that stuff, it's going to feel a little clunky. Because I think now your expectation is like, okay, I'm at this thing or I'm at this door, like the game should know that when I press the button, I want to use the key card on the door or whatever. And I think the fact that this game sort of like makes you do everything. But I think, you know, as fairly linear-ish games go, it could be up there with certainly like the Resident Evil 4 remake. What I hope is the intent with this, but I honestly don't, without Kojima, I don't know how they're going to do it, is that they're using this to gauge how passionate the audience still is about this franchise, because it would be great to get a new one. Like built for this generation of consoles and PC, like a 2023, 2024 tech, like building Metal Gear for right now, I think would be pretty spectacular. I think it's challenging for them because there are so many people that associate this franchise with Kojima that, you know, when they have tried to do it without him in the past, it didn't go down as well. But I think you've got to go deep into the mythology and use, you know, the Snake line, and like you got to use characters that people are familiar with. You need David Hayter doing the voice. You know, there are certain things that make it Metal Gear, but it was a lot more daring than it ever really got credit for politically, and just in some sort of like observations of society and predicting the future, and like some stuff that seemed really wacky back when Metal Gear 2 and Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3 came out, like aren't so far-fetched now. I mean, obviously the technology that is in it is still a bit wacky, but some of the geopolitics that he was touching on and the message that he was trying to send about war and private military organizations, and like a lot of it is like he was pretty on the nose with it.
While Metal Gear Solid has since progressed and achieved new heights and lows with its subsequent releases, it's thanks to the groundwork laid by Snake Eater that not only helped Metal Gear Solid continue to receive commercial and critical success, but also cement itself as one of the tentpole franchises in interactive media.
I tend to like think about how influential stuff is, and you know, I think in that regard, they did such a fantastic job with this game.
Commencing virtuous mission now.